In the first place, thank you very much for the invitation to come here. It's very nice to be here, first time. Nice colors. I'm a pathologist by formation and training, and these colors are pleasantly like our coloring agents in pathology. So nice to be homey. This is a small overview. My presentation doesn't necessarily have to follow the lines that were here, because we do the presentations about 4 weeks before, and in the meantime, life goes on, and so things progress. So don't hesitate to interrupt if you want to clarify anything, or if you want me to go in a certain direction. First, I'll give you a small history. The EU decided to start funding research in around the 1980s, and the Commission doesn't have the possibility of attributing and handling funds from the EU pot directly. So there is an artifice that happens. In other words, the Commission is granted the capacity to administer the funds directly and give them directly to citizens or citizen institutes or groups by framework programs. So they are limited in space and time, and they have to have a political agreement. This political agreement started off by being council only. Council is the meeting of all the member states and the ministers thereof. And later on, when Parliament became more important, it became a decision, a co-decision procedure in our slang, co-decision procedure between the Commission that proposes the legislation or the framework programs or whatever it is that wants to be discussed, and on one side the Parliament, and on the other side the Council. So here I am in the Commission with two bosses. One of my bosses is the European Parliament, so I have to keep them happy, and the other boss, very important, is the member states. Now, these two, in the first place, it was predominantly council. Later on, it's become more equal. They decided that they wanted to fund research directly, and they started with the Biomed 1 and Biomed 2 programs. They were minute little programs, but they became quite successful. People were looking for funding in that direction. They know that they have to have 3 member states working together, and then other things derivated from there in a cascade, and I'll show you later on a slide with multitudes of possibilities of funding. And these programs started growing, and everything was going hunky-dory until in Framework Program 4, they're numbered. Some of them have names. Biomed was Framework Work Program 1 and 2, and then so on and so forth. FP6, Framework Program 6, doesn't have a specific name, as doesn't FP7, but FP8 is called Horizon 2020. They gave it a name. But it's basically the same thing. So around Framework Program 4, there started being an environment in the real world outside the Commission funding, a lot of angst about the ethics. Now, in Europe, there are 2 lines of thought. There are the Mediterranean countries that think that ethics is different from deontology, deontology being the good manners between work and the citizen. And ethics is something more elevated and more principles and so on and so forth, whereas in the Anglo-Saxon world, ethics is amalgamated into everything, and this creates a few problems. Because very often, ethics in science and ethics in the workplace is confused between something which is for the police and other things which is for the law and other things which is for the discussion in the realms of ideas. But at the same time, it coalesced with at the same time as Framework Program 4, coalesced into the idea that research had to be for elevated purposes, and the citizens should be proud of the research that was being done, particularly, we didn't want to have any scandals, and this was what it comes up to. The member states could do without the scandals. Later on, the European Parliament could do without the scandals, and now, of course, ethics is, in part, a fortress against scandals. This was Europe, because this is a very political funding. And in order to avoid these problems, avoid being sued, avoid having the press give us a very bad name, not only us, but the scientists that we fund, people sort of tend to be harder on the scientists that the European Union funds, the Commission funds, than on the other scientists that are funded from the national programs or from Volkswagen agencies or from whatever agency. So, in fact, there was a reunion, a meeting between experts, and the possibility of stopping these problems was analyzed. And two visions arose. One is, let's do the science, and if there is a problem, we'll see if the ethics was in place, which is what most of the world does. And then the directors in RTD with the Parliament and the Council decided that this wasn't good enough and that we had to come up with something else. We came up with the ex-ante ethics review. Rather than the ex-post, we came up with the ex-ante. So here in this slide, you've got the contrast between the two. Basically, ex-ante ethics review, as we understand it, is something that we created in order to manage risk. It is a risk management tool. Considering that risk is inherent to science, and if we're doing science that doesn't have the risk of finding something, then it's not science. It's something else, but it's certainly not science. I can say that risk is inherent to research, and so we need to protect the whole of the reputation, not only of the EU, but of the scientists that are working for the EU. So we opted for an ex-ante ethics review, which functioned during FP4 and FP5, and even FP6. But in FP6, this was already the beginning of the 2000s. It started in 2003, FP6. In 2003, the environment started to become really complex because we started funding research that was further down the pipeline. So it was not only basic research, but we started introducing clinical trials. Clinical trials, of course, bring this panorama. This is my nightmare. You've all seen this. I could tell you stories like this one all the time, but it's probably going to be bad for your health, so I'll refrain. So in FP6, we had no problems of a major kind. We only had 3 or 4 projects that didn't get funded or landed into trouble because of the ethics. And even that didn't touch upon anybody's reputation or our policy or our scientists, or nobody got sued. But in FP7, we were going to get 76 billion to attribute into science, into the hands of the scientists. Some projects very, very big, already, not only the Articles 185 and 169 and so on and so forth, which are meetings and kinds of associations that we fund. We're going to be doing clinical trials, but we were also going to be funding directly clinical trials in areas that were quite risk rich. So we had an ex-ante ethics review that touched upon certain subjects with a bigger incidence and completely not ignored, but passed over others. Anything that had ethics issues in them, like human embryonic stem cells, which some people get very anxious about, and clinical trials on children, research on animals, particularly the non-human primates. Data protection was considered to be relatively benign. All of that would have an ethics review if flagged, but this ethics review would become more pointed in certain cases. And the certain cases were if there was no specific EU-level legislation to regulate this research, which meant that there would be political sensitivity, for example, on any clinical trial on children, any clinical trial on developing countries, any research funded through the human embryonic stem cell exception to the rules, and, of course, non-human primates. That would have an accrued ethics review. Everything else would go with just ex post ethics review. I thought it was a very, very risky idea. We started thinking of ways to manage to have a two-tiered system. We came up with the screening and an ethics review, which we conducted through FP7. FP7 finished in 2013. We had approximately 1,000 projects. And we conducted an analysis of this. We invited some experts from outside the EU to analyze the statistics of what we had. And we checked the impact of the screening only on something which was already a decent amelioration of the ethics review system as compared to the rest of the world. So the possibilities were that issues were not identified, which was in our case very rare, but in the outside world it's very frequent. Scientists are not experts in everything. Sometimes things that are obvious to a social scientist or to a lawyer are absolutely mysterious to a doctor. The issue could be identified, but no ethics review would be requested. Like, for example, work on viruses and mosquitoes, or work on flu. The issue was identified and had an ethics review with requirements and so on and so forth that had to be replied to, identified, and the information given. And then special requirements were included in this ethics review. So these were the 5 tiers of possibilities that we identified in this ethics review, even ex ante. When we analyzed the risk and the risk management, the baseline our experts detected for problems of an ethics kind in an ex post ethics review are in the order of 6%. And this doesn't mean that all risks of having a problem are very large, and it's very dangerous risks. So not everybody gets a Volkswagen type 30% cut in their value. But somebody who has a problem with one of the clinical trials and they have to request for the insurance and so on and so forth, to the real problems. So ex post is approximately 6%. With an ex ante ethics review, we get something like 1.6% of issues that have to be taken care of. With the screening, in other words, the data protection and all the other get decent quantity of governance and management thrown in, you go down to 1.3. Doesn't sound very convincing, but if you have 1,000 projects, which is our case for FP7, the difference is between 16 big problems and 13 problems. 3 problems could be the big ones. Data protection, people coming in and asking for questions about what happened to my data and why was it exported. Give me $1 billion. So, in FP7, out of 1,000 of our projects, I'm only talking about health, everything was financed and there were no problems with the ethics. In fact, only one critical situation arose, which was, in fact, a project that has to deal with well, it wouldn't have had an ethics review in depth because it was only dealing with mosquitoes and viruses and something completely different, but it ended up with peculiar situations, and so the Parliament started asking questions. So out of 1,019 projects, we had no critical juridical problems. Even the one that had questions in Parliament got answered. It was evacuated, and there was no court action or even political action taken, which is pretty good. So, this is my nightmare. I'm going to tell you the story of my nightmare. Once upon a project. Imagine this. We've got some money, 32 million, that is being divided by into a consortium of 3 member states. And this is, of course, something very interesting. The scientists all agreed that it was fascinating, very sound science, very interesting behavioral patterns to be studied and followed up. It was scientifically extremely sound, so it was chosen. It got 32 million. And not only are the scientists involved people who are slightly in the limelight, but also the subject matter is very interesting because it means that you can trace people, you can trace patterns of behavior. So some of the queries started arising, not only because some of the scientists with the money started becoming much more in the limelight and so on and so forth, but also because of the subject matter. The queries from the newspapers start becoming a little bit more political. And somebody complains to the Member of Parliament, the news media, and everybody suddenly starts getting into this rage. How could anybody fund such an outrage? How could anybody do this? Members of Parliament were not happy. They started asking questions. The European Commission, of course, answers. We are funding this outrage because the scientists thought that it was a good idea. It's scientific, very sound. We cart the experts to the European Parliament, and then the question comes, we have been financing it, but it's got an ethics review, and it's got an ex-ante ethics review. And all measures of mitigation, preventive measures, everything was requested. I don't say that they were given, but requested. So we implemented this ethics framework, and it's there. So due diligence was proved, and the turmoil slowly decreased. Now, I'm not sure that you follow the news very, very closely, but this actually happened. So we congratulated ourselves and sort of heaved a sigh of relief. The members of Parliament were happy, the Commission was happy, the newspapers went away. So the ex-ante scrutiny is quite important because it's proactive, it's preventive, and it shows thoughtfulness. Huge projects with many issues and many countries involved are a hotbed for problems. Nobody or very few people are specialized or are interested in checking how the different legislations in each of the member states or even third states work. Common legislation is only just beginning to appear. So we've got from directives you go into regulations. That changes the applicability and the interpretation quite significantly, but these are only just starting to come into our areas. The ethics review is, in fact, a nice frame. In fact, when we look at our projects, we have the skeleton, which is the budget. The way the scientists divide the budget gives us an idea of what the research is going to be. It's like a skeleton on which you hang all the organs and the muscles and so on and so forth. The function depends on this skeleton. But holding everything together is the ethics. Because if the ethics and the regulatory aspect isn't there, we run the risk of having a wound with hemorrhage, and people of the clinical persuasion know what that means. It can conduce to death. So, this was what I was talking about. The coat hangers are supposed to be the budget. The nice picture frame, not the picture, the frame, is the ethics framework. And in fact, this stops us from wasting money on lawsuits and administrative procedures to keep us safe, in fact. Not just the European Commission, because with our contracts, it's very difficult for the people who fund the research to actually get into trouble. We would be able to get into trouble if it was a political issue, but from a risk and liability issue, we're more or less safe. But we can't protect you. So the European Commission is unable to say, these are our scientists, we protect them from anything. It's impossible. We can't do that. So we have to help you to protect yourselves from nasty issues. So these are the issues that require an ethics review. Human embryos and fetuses, of course, are automatically audited. They get an ethics audit. In other words, it's a regulatory and ethical audit. It's automatic. Doesn't always happen, but they're all open to audit. Informed consent is something that is very important. Any research on humans, any research on embryos, fetuses, anything that has data, be it genetic or even data, with consent. You can do it. Without consent, it's very difficult, and it's bordering on the illegal. Research on animals has its specific regulatory framework, so you have to prove that it's there, and if you're legal, it's okay. Research in developing countries, of course, is a completely different kettle of fish because it's entirely political. The only thing we can do is to ask the researchers who do research in third countries to make sure that the standards that are applied in their research in this third country is equivalent and symmetrical to ones that are applied in Europe. I don't think we should ask for more nor less. Dual use occasionally comes into play because, of course, we are studying everything biological, so everything biological can become a biological weapon. It's a bit silly, but what can we do? It happens. So, governance of the ethics in projects has to do with the rules and the legislative basis that is there. In fact, we only ask people to make sure that their institutes are in order, that the documents are there. Sometimes we ask these things to be sent. It's for convenience and for your convenience as well, for the scientists' convenience as well, because when we're asked for an audit, if we've got all the documentation there, you don't even know that it happens. The audit goes through, and you just know the results. We check things are there, that the documentation is there, the auditors go by, and it's perfect. You get the response to say, congratulations, your project was perfect. And we get very happy because we vindicated, of course, but in your case, it's better because if it's found not to be an order, you can get sued by the Commission to get the money back. So this is quite an important thing, that the ethics audits are impeccable. It's the first line of patient and scientist defense to have this regulatory framework in place. I call this, in fact, the whole framework of governance, the ethics governance of science, a preventive ethics. But the advantage of having a preventive ethics is that you get a suitcase full of traceable regulatory conformity. So if your research ever comes to a product, it's already got the regulatory conformity suitcase of traceability so that it should go through the EMA procedures much more fast, much quicker, and with less angst. So this is why the ethics is useful. We have ethics central to the EU research. We cannot fund research that is less than ethical. Why? Because we've got 30-odd points of view of the world, different legislation, so everything more or less has to agree. We don't have to be the same. We can agree to disagree. But we have to check that the legislation is followed in each member state because it's the only thing that protects us. The only way that we can manage to fund human embryonic stem cell research during the time when in the US it was forbidden, you could not fund human embryonic stem cell research with federal funds, we continued because we had this respect for the legislations and the habits, the cultures of each of the member states. We don't force anybody to do it, but we don't stop anybody from doing it either. And it's this balance and respect for each one's culture and legislation that made us able to go to the parliament and to the member states and to say, we are doing it because you don't like it, but somebody else does. So we can claim this respect for other point of view because we keep it. We call it subsidiarity, of course, give it a bigger name. So ethics is not just paperwork, and it's not just for health. Because if you go into food for animals and for aeronautics and so on, more and more we're beginning to get the human element there. So the ethics becomes quite important. Also, with the food and the feed and the agriculture, we get other issues that are important and that bring in the environment. So our method has spread out and it has become general to the Commission. So it's not just health. Now it's food and it's aeronautics and it's transport and everything, and a lot of data protection. So all the IT is coming in with an ethics review that is similar to ours. Well, I have found that as a tool for risk management, it's great, and we're beginning to get the signs that the regulatory conformity paper trail is beginning to give some return, because some of our projects are already getting products, and since they've got the regulatory aspect, they go into the EMA and they get already less months for acceptance and for validation. Foolproof ER is very important, particularly for cell therapy and for any product or any research that has to do with controversial or risky areas. And cell therapy, of course, is the epitome of risk. If you've got any problems with cell therapy, you've got a patient who is usually very sick, and it's a one-on-one activity, so it can get very, very stressful, and the ethics review and the framework for it can be very helpful. So, take-home message is, I'd rather spend my money on research than on lawyers. The ethics contributes to the quality of the whole research system, also because it obliges the scientist to think a little bit outside the box. And it gives the scientist the possibility of actually evaluating what assets there are in the hands. You've got huge assets that you don't even look at as assets until you are forced to think about giving them away. Like, for example, the data on your patients. It's highly valuable. If people are willing to give them away, very well. It just shows that you don't value your assets, because it is an asset. Pharmaceutical companies are killing to have their hands on this kind of data. Treated by an intelligent collector of these data, it becomes a secondary data. It belongs to the person who treated it, whereas the individual raw data belongs to the owners of the data. So the individual person who gave you the data owns it and gave it to you, but the person who treats it begins to own the secondary data. So if you don't value your own intellectual property, it's your business, but we should think about it. So don't give away your assets, because once data is given away, it becomes lost forever. Not only data, but samples, knowledge, invention, property. Think about what you have, think about your assets, think about your mind and your ideas as something that is very, very valuable, because they are input for patents. And even though I think that many people agree that patenting knowledge and patenting something that has been given to us by nature or by our patients is borderline respectable. Some people do, some people don't. Patents have opened the scientific world to a lot of offended reactions from the public, because the public says, okay, so we give them our samples and then they patent what is coming from our samples. I think that this was a slippery slope. We should have isolated the gift and the interaction between the scientist and the population a little bit more. Again, it was some capital that we gave away. We shouldn't have, because we didn't think properly. So the ethics has become very important also to defend ourselves from this position that we managed to slip into. Unfortunately, we now have to defend ourselves when previously nobody would think about suing or trying to go after a research institute. Now people are quite happy to go after a research institute because they patent things, so they're making money out of us, so we might as well get some of it back. There are now patient institutions who are thinking about selling the data for the patients in return for a discount on treatments. And this is being very seriously discussed. So this is where we are. It's the new world. The main focus, of course, both on data and on samples and on gifts from the population, is the consent. If you make sure that you've got a reasonable consent, it's just a question of clicking it. Organize yourself in such a way that when you start getting your samples, getting your data, getting your information, it's consented. There are electronic tools available for you to do this. The Commission funded a project that developed a consent tool that is electronic and that is adaptable. There is a company that is available to do this. They're only a telephone call away, and they will give you this tool for free. If you can't find other tool in the market, you have recourse to this one, and you get a perfect tool that you can take with you in a USB key, and that you never lose your patients. The mice will never eat this consent form. Data protection is very important. We now have a regulation that is being discussed in Parliament and in co-decision, and it seems that it deals with small data and big data and all sorts of data. We don't know what it's going to turn out into. We have in the Commission during the ethics review, we assume the most stringent aspects are going to be the law, because our projects live for 6 years plus 5, which they're supposed to keep their documentation. So they live for about 10 years. So the legislation they'll be under is for 10 years. So we assume the most stringent, and we ask people to take precautions according to the most stringent of these, so that they don't have to change halfway. So, funding opportunities. Here we are. We've got IMI, the SME instrument, Fast Track to Innovation, the European Research Council, Industrial Leadership, Eureka. All these instruments are areas where you can find funding opportunities for this research, for research into life sciences. It's a little bit complicated to look for, but I think that most institutes now have dedicated people to look for this funding opportunity. Personalized medicine seems to be the most interesting area for the next work program in our health. It's 995 million approximately, all together with the coordination activities and the SME instruments. We do have some collaboration with the IT people, so there is a lot of research. So all the electronic and the data management areas can be funded through other DGs or specific projects with them. IMI, of course, has a lot of money. They've got as much money as we do for the community research and the ERC, so we're more or less the same numbers of in hard cash. They have their calls, they're separate from ours, and we have to have some adaptation with them, so we don't run the same calls. But every now and so often it happens, like for example in the Ebola call. It was quite similar. Thank you very much for your attention.